From the ancient tribes forging a nation in fire and ice, to the iron will of czars shaping an empire, Russia's story is one of relentless ambition.
It's a huge topic, stretching across time.
It really is. And our goal here isn't just to list dates and names. We want to delve into these materials, pull out the core insights, and trace the connections, the forces that have really shaped Russia.
Looking at those key dynamics from the very beginning right up to now.
Exactly. Trying to build a layered picture. We'll move through different dimensions, geography, politics, economics, culture, and see how they all interact across time.
Okay, let's start at the foundation then, the land itself. What does Russia's geography tell us?
Well, the geography is just fundamental. It's sheer size, spanning Eastern Europe and Northern Asia. That's the first thing. And it's dominated by these vast plains, the Great European Plain, the West Siberian Plain.
Relatively open terrain.
Right, which meant potential for settlement, but also, a lack of natural barriers. This made early peoples quite vulnerable to movements, especially from the steppes to the south.
But the rivers were key.
Oh, absolutely crucial. The Volga, the Dnieper, and others. They were the highways for trade, for migration, for communication. Made connection possible across those huge distances.
And then there's the climate. General winter comes up a lot.
It's not just a saying. That continental climate, the long, harsh winters, it's been a formidable natural defense, against invaders like Napoleon or Hitler.
But also a challenge.
Huge challenge. It really limits the growing season, making agriculture tough outside the fertile zones like the southern Black Earth region. Food security was always a concern.
So the land and weather are almost active characters in the story.
Precisely. And different zones meant different lifestyles. Tundra in the north, reindeer herding, the taiga forests, vital for timber and furs, big early trade items, and the southern steppe, fertile, but also that pathway for nomadic groups.
Environmental issues aren't just a modern problem either, are they?
No, the sources show things like deforestation happening during imperial expansion. And later, Soviet industrialization brought massive pollution and land damage. Resource dependence, especially on fossil fuels now, is a continuation of that interaction, shaping the economy, but also bringing vulnerabilities and environmental costs.
Right. So geography is never just a backdrop.
It actively shapes settlement, economy, defense, everything.
Okay, moving back even further, before organized states, what about the prehistoric foundations?
Archaeology shows human presence going way back, maybe 1.5 million years in the North Caucasus, and Homo sapiens later across Siberia and European Russia. Diverse groups adapted to these lands.
Who were they?
You had hunter-gatherers first, then Neolithic cultures developing farming, pottery, and a real diversity of indigenous groups. Finno-Ugric peoples north, Turkic nomads like Pechenegs and Cumans south, Iranian-speaking Scythians. These weren't simple societies. They had their own complex traditions, languages, social structures, often based around kinship. Their oral traditions are part of Russia's deep past.
And these early groups laid some groundwork.
In a way, yes. Their ways of organizing, their interactions with the land. That's the context into which later states emerged, even if those states often came through conquest.
Which brings us to Kievan Rus's, the first major state formation mentioned.
Correct. Formed by Eastern Slavs, late 9th century. The chronicles mention the Varangian prince Rurik, though the extent of Norse influence versus Slavic development is debated, the whole Normanist controversy. Prince Oleg is credited with unifying north and south, moving the capital to Kiev around 882, strategically vital location.
And the conversion to Christianity seems like a defining moment.
Absolutely pivotal. Vladimir I, Vladimir the Great, adopting Orthodox Christianity from Byzantium in 988. This wasn't just religious, it was deeply political, cultural. It provided a unifying ideology, shaped identity for centuries, influenced law like the Ruskaya Pravda, the legal code, art, architecture. It created this synthesis of Byzantine, Slavic, and Scandinavian elements, and crucially, plugged Rus' into the wider Byzantine world. Kiev became a major center, controlling that key trade route, the Varangian Road. Yaroslav the Wise in the 11th century really developed it as a cultural hub.
But this unity didn't hold.
No, it started declining late 11th century. Internal factors were key dynastic squabbles, princes fighting over territory after Yaroslav, plus external factors like Byzantium weakening. That fragmentation was dangerous.
Setting the stage for the Mongol invasion, that feels like a fundamental break.
It was a massive disruption. Beyond Byzantium's influence, the Mongol invasion was arguably the single most significant external shock. They first tested the waters of the Kaka River in 1223, showing the princes' disunity.
And the full invasion.
Led by Batu Khan, 1237-1240. Incredibly brutal. Cities destroyed, culminating in the sack of Kiev in 1240. That effectively ended Kievan Rus as a unified entity.
Leading to the Tatar yoke. What did that mean in practice?
Most Rus's principalities became tributaries to the Golden Horde. It wasn't always direct rule everywhere, but princes needed the Khan's approval, the Yarlik, to rule. This actually fostered rivalry among them, vying for the Khan's favor.
And the tribute.
Heavy. A significant economic drain. Though interestingly, the Orthodox Church was often protected, even tax-exempt, which allowed it to consolidate influence. Mongol officials, the Beskaki, oversaw collection initially.
So devastation, but are there other long-term effects discussed?
Yes, and this is where historical interpretation gets really interesting. The traditional view emphasizes the negative: destruction, isolation from Western Europe during the Renaissance, economic backwardness.
But there's another side?
Some argue, and this includes the Eurasianist perspective, that Mongol rule, maybe unintentionally, contributed to centralization. The need to collect tribute efficiently favored pragmatic princes, especially Moscow's, who learned to work with the horde. They used Mongol backing to expand.
So they might have adopted some Mongol methods.
That's part of the argument. Things like administrative systems, fiscal practices, maybe even concepts of strong centralized rule were absorbed or adapted. It unified a vast area, and Moscow eventually inherited aspects of that.
It's a complex legacy then, not just destruction.
Exactly. Modern scholarship acknowledges the immense human cost, but also these complex, debated influences on state building, alongside the continuity of Russ's traditions and the church. And the yoke itself become a powerful story in Russian identity overcoming foreign domination.
After the Mongols, Moscow emerges as the new center.
Right. The Grand Duchy of Moscow is that key transition phase. And Ivan III, the Great, ruling from 1462 to 1505, is pivotal here.
What were his main achievements?
He's credited with effectively ending Mongol dominance. The standoff at the Ugar River in 1480 is often cited. He consolidated lands around Moscow, tripled its size, rebuilt the Kremlin, really laid the groundwork for a national state. And importantly, he asserted absolute sovereignty, styling himself as an autocrat, created central government bodies too.
Setting the stage for the Tsardom, starting with Ivan the Terrible.
Ivan IV, crowned the first Tsar in 1547. Tsar Caesar signifying supreme authority. He further strengthened autocracy, expanded territory, but his reign is really defined by the Oprachina,
What exactly was that?
a period of state terror, essentially. Ivan created a separate domain, the Oprachina, ruled directly by him through a loyal force. They brutally targeted perceived enemies, especially among the old aristocracy, the boyars, with executions, land confiscations.
Consolidating power through fear.
That seems to have been the aim, destroying potential rivals. But it caused immense disruption and instability.
Which led into the time of troubles.
A really dark period, 1598-1613. Civil war, dynastic crisis after Ivan's line ended, terrible famine, foreign intervention, particularly Polish forces occupying Moscow. It nearly destroyed the state.
Until the Romanovs.
Right. The election of Michael Romanov in 1613 ended the chaos and established the dynasty that would rule for 300 years. But that experience, the fear of collapse, deeply reinforced the idea that Russia needed a strong autocratic hand.
That fear of fragmentation again?
Yes, it's a recurring theme. And that drive for strong central power hits another peak with Peter the Great. Peter, ruling 1689-1725, famous for his sweeping, often forceful modernization and westernization. He reorganized everything: government, army, navy. He secularized schools, brought the church under state control by creating the Holy Synod,
Pushed science, industry.
founded St. Petersburg as his window to Europe, and his victory in the Great Northern War against Sweden secured Baltic access, making Russia a major European power. He formally declared the Russian Empire in 1721.
But the sources mention his methods were harsh.
Extremely harsh.
Yeah.
Known for cruelty, tyranny, ruthlessly suppressed opposition, financed his reforms and wars with heavy taxes. Some point to his use of terror as setting a precedent.
Jumping ahead to the 19th century, Alexander II and the pressure for reform.
Alexander II, the Tsar Reformer, 1855-1881. The Crimean War defeat really exposed Russia's weaknesses. That spurred him towards major reforms, most famously abolishing serfdom in 1861.
Huge, James.
Monumental. He also reformed the judiciary, local government with the Zemstvos, education.
But these reforms didn't solve everything.
Far from it. Emancipation, for example, was flawed. Peasants often got poor land and had to pay redemption fees, which caused hardship and unrest. These unresolved tensions actually fueled revolutionary movements.
Leading to his assassination.
Yes, and his son, Alexander III, reacted strongly. Reversed liberal reforms, clamped down, reasserted autocracy, pushed Russification policies. Though, interestingly, state-led industrialization continued under him, including the Trans-Siberian Railway.
All this building towards the 20th century revolution.
Absolutely. The 1905 revolution, sparked by defeat against Japan and Bloody Sunday, forced Nicholas II into concessions, the October Manifesto, creating the Duma, a limited parliament. But it was too little, too late for many.
Then 1917.
The breaking point. World War I hardship, economic chaos, political paralysis. The February Revolution swept away the Tsar. Then the provisional government struggled. Soviets gained influence, and finally the Bolsheviks under Lenin seized power in the October Revolution. But that wasn't the end of the fighting. The Russian Civil War followed, 1918-1922. A brutal conflict. Reds versus whites, various other groups, foreign intervention.
And the Bolsheviks won.
Yes, they consolidated power, but at a terrible cost. Millions died from fighting, famine, the Red Terror. This experience really hardened the regime, reinforced centralization, and created a sense of being besieged. It led directly to forming the USSR in 1922.
Followed by the Stalin era.
Joseph Stalin consolidated power after Lenin's death, becoming dictator by 1929. His rule, until 1953, was defined by totalitarian control, brutal repression, the Great Purge eliminating millions of perceived enemies, the Gulag system of forced labor camps.
And radical economic transformation.
Yes, the 5-year plans, starting around 1928. Massive, state-driven industrialization, focusing on heavy industry, aiming to catch up with the West and build military strength. It achieved rapid industrial growth.
But the human cost in agriculture was staggering.
Catastrophic. Forced collectivization, eliminating private farms, forcing peasants onto state-run collective farms was implemented ruthlessly. It was meant to control agriculture and extract resources for industry.
But it led to famine.
Devastating famines,
Like-
especially in Ukraine, the Holodomor, but also Kazakhstan, southern Russia. Millions died from starvation, directly resulting from state policies like grain confiscation. It was state-engineered terror and famine.
What happened to the Soviet system after Stalin?
Khrushchev initiated a thaw, de-Stalinization, some limited reforms. Then came Brezhnev and the era of stagnation, political stability, but economic slowdown, inefficiency, corruption, and growing reliance on oil and gas exports.
A pattern we see again.
Right. By the mid-'80s under Gorbachev, the system was clearly failing. He tried reforms of perestroika, economic restructuring, and glasnost, openness.
Which unintentionally led to the collapse.
That's how it played out. Glasnost unleashed forces Gorbachev couldn't control: nationalism, dissent. Perestroika didn't fix the economy fast enough. The failed hardliner coup in August '91 fatally weakened the center, and the USSR dissolved in December 1991.
Then the chaotic 90s under Yeltsin.
A tumultuous transition. Shock therapy reforms, rapid market liberalization, privatization, led to economic collapse, hyperinflation, huge inequality, the rise of the oligarchs, controlling privatized assets, political instability too, the Chechen Wars.
And since 2000, the Putin era.
Marked by re-centralization of power, stabilization largely fueled by energy revenues, but also growing authoritarianism, a kind of managed democracy, and a much more assertive foreign policy. That dependence on resources remains a key economic factor.
Shifting focus to social structures, Russia was historically very hierarchical.
Deeply stratified. Before Peter, you had the boyar aristocracy, clergy, merchants, and the vast majority peasants, mostly serfs bound to the land. Peter created a service nobility, tied to state rank. And serfdom itself, formalized in 1649, was defining until 1861. It was essentially a form of bondage, shaping everything. Emancipation was huge, but as we said, flawed, creating new problems.
What about Soviet society? They aimed for classlessness.
Ideologically, yes. But in practice, a new hierarchy emerged. The nomenklatura, the party elite, held the power and privilege. Though a large, educated, technocratic middle class also developed over time, post-Soviet Russia saw stark new inequalities for the oligarchs.
Demographics have also seen massive shifts.
Huge changes. Eastward expansion and colonization over centuries. Then massive, often forced migrations under Stalin, ethnic deportations, peasants displaced by collectivization. Rapid urbanization during Soviet industrialization was another major shift.
From mostly rural to mostly urban?
Exactly, now over 70% urban. But modern challenges include demographic decline, low birth rates, health issues, regional disparities.
And Russia's famous ethnic diversity.
Immense diversity. Over 120 ethnic groups. Policies towards them have swung back and forth, periods of forced Russification, trying to impose Russian language and culture, other times allowing limited autonomy. Managing this diversity is ongoing.
And family, gender roles?
Traditionally patriarchal. Soviet policies officially promoted women's equality, bringing them into the workforce and education in large numbers. But a double burden often remained work plus primary responsibility for home and family. Post-Soviet times have seen some resurgence of traditionalist views.
Let's turn to culture, intellect, religion, the heart of identity.
It's an incredibly rich area. World-famous literature, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, exploring profound themes, iconic art from medieval icons to the avant-garde like Kandinsky, Chagall, music Tchaikovsky, Stravinsky. And central to all this historically is the Orthodox Church. Adopted in 988, it shaped spirituality, identity, values, art, architecture. The church hierarchy became deeply intertwined with the state, especially after the Patriarchate was established in 1589.
But that relationship with the state wasn't static.
It's not at all. Peter the Great brought it firmly under state control with the Holy Synod in 1721. Then the Soviet era was devastating official atheism, widespread persecution, church closures. Beliefs survived underground, though.
And post-Soviet.
A major resurgence. The church is again a prominent institution, often closely aligned with the state, seen as a pillar of national identity. Though other religions, Islam, Buddhism, Judaism, also have long histories within Russia's borders.
What about intellectual life? Major debates.
Key debates revolved around Russia's destiny. The 18th century Enlightenment had its impact. Then the 19th century saw that classic split. Westernizers wanting to adopt European models versus Slavophiles, emphasizing Russia's unique path, orthodoxy, communal values.
That tension seems constant.
It really is. You see echoes of it throughout. Early 20th century had vibrant avant-garde culture before Soviet ideology took hold. Dissidents challenged the system later. Post-Soviet thought is more varied, but still grappling with Russia's place, Europe, Asia, Eurasian.
And education's role in all this?
Started limited, mostly clergy nobility. Peter expanded secular education. The Soviets made a huge push for mass literacy and universal education, seeing it as vital for modernization. They achieved near total literacy and expanded higher technical education dramatically. High literacy remains, strong STEM fields, though brain drain is an issue now.
Given the geography and history, military power seems central.
Absolutely unavoidable. Russia's history is full of major conflicts shaping its trajectory. The Mongol invasion, Napoleon's failed invasion in 1812, General Winter plus resistance became legendary. World War II, the Great Patriotic War, as it's known in Russia, was an existential struggle on the Eastern Front. The scale of fighting and brutality, especially Nazi Germany's genocidal aims, was immense.
Turning points like Stalingrad, Kursk.
Crucial. The Soviet victory came at an almost unimaginable cost, tens of millions dead. But it cemented the USSR as a superpower, leading directly into the Cold War.
And the Cold War was defined by that rivalry with the U.S.
From the Soviet viewpoint, it was a struggle against U.S. imperialism. They saw actions like creating the Warsaw Pact, supporting socialist movements worldwide, as necessary responses to U.S. containment policy and influence.
High-stakes moments like the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Exactly. Showed how dangerous the confrontation was. The invasion of Afghanistan in '79 reignited tensions later on. Contemporary security issues, like relations with NATO, still reflect these deep-seated concerns about borders and influence.
How has Russia's position on the world stage evolved overall?
It's been a long arc. Kievan Rus has interacted with Byzantium, nomads. Peter made Russia a European power. The 19th century saw it as part of the European balance, but also conflicts like the Crimean War loss. Then the Soviet Union became one of two global superpowers after World War II, dominating Eastern Europe, playing a key role in the UN, leading the socialist bloc.
Until its collapse in 1991.
Which was a major geopolitical shift. Russia lost superpower status but remained the key successor state, keeping the UN Security Council seat, the nuclear arsenal. The 90s under Yeltsin saw attempts at integration with the West, but tensions quickly grew over NATO expansion, Yugoslavia.
Leading to Putin's more assertive stance.
Yes, a clear shift towards restoring Russia's perceived great power status, asserting influence in its neighborhood, the near abroad. Actions in Georgia, Crimea, Ukraine have dramatically escalated tensions with the West, leading to sanctions and Russia increasingly looking towards non-Western partnerships.
So bringing it all together, what are the key modern challenges emerging from this history?
The last century, especially post-WWII, has been about navigating immense change. Cold War, Soviet collapse, post-Soviet transition. There's an ongoing search for national identity amidst globalization.
Governance remains a central issue.
Yes, That historical tension between strong centralized control and democratic impulses continues. The current system is often described as a form of managed democracy with significant state control. Socially, there are demographic pressures, health issues, navigating cultural shifts, including that revived traditionalism and the church's role.
Economically.
The heavy reliance on natural resources, particularly energy, remains a core challenge. Diversification is needed, especially facing global market shifts and sanctions. Environmental legacies from Soviet industry and current issues like climate change are also major concerns. Ultimately, contemporary Russia is wrestling with these deep historical patterns, authoritarian traditions, resource dependence, the complex cultural identity balancing East and West as it tries to define its path forward. The Soviet legacy is inescapable.
And finally, how is this history itself understood and written about within Russia, historiography?
That's a fascinating and crucial aspect. How history is told is deeply tied to politics. Soviet historiography, for instance, was tightly controlled, often presenting triumphal narratives, justifying or denying difficult events like the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact or the Katyn Massacre or the Holodomor famine.
Did Stalin himself shape historical narratives?
Very much so. He promoted interpretations that glorified strong leaders who centralized power and expanded the state, directly linking his rule to figures like Ivan the Terrible or Peter the Great. Power and historical narrative were explicitly linked.
What about after the Soviet Union?
The 90s saw more open debate, revisiting many suppressed topics. But more recently, there's been a trend towards nationalist interpretations, re-emphasizing state strength, national pride, sometimes rehabilitating controversial figures or downplaying repressions.
So the past is still contested ground.
Absolutely. Debates over the Mongol impact, Peter the Great, the Revolution, Stalin, WWII, they aren't just academic. They're about present-day identity, legitimacy, and Russia's place in the world. Access to archives can still be challenging, sources need careful interpretation, and marginalized histories often get less attention.
It's clear you can't understand Russia today without understanding these deep historical roots and patterns.
Definitely. Those patterns, the drive for centralized power, the complex dance with the West, the state's economic role, the cultural identity questions, territorial concerns, they run deep and continue to shape events.
So even huge upheavals like 1917 or 1991 didn't wipe the slate clean.
There were massive discontinuities for sure, redirecting Russia's path. But they interacted with these enduring forces. It's that constant interplay between radical change and deep historical continuity that makes understanding Russia so challenging and so important.
It certainly gives you a lot to consider, thinking about that enduring tension, that pull between Western models and asserting a unique Russian identity. How might that play out now in today's global context? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us today.